Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Today we are happy to welcome back to Strategicon via Skype from Truro, Cornwall, Commodore Patrick J. Tyrrell, OBE Royal Navy retired, who is chairman of the Sage International Australia Advisory Board and our resident expert in European security and international military affairs. The month of September was a busy one for European security. The international media ran many stories of Western alarm at the Russian military exercise Zapad-17. Russian behavior toward the West is obtuse. It is often difficult to read whether the country wants to cooperate with the West, undermine and split Western political leadership, or directly antagonize it as the Soviets did during the Cold War. The idea of Russia being an antagonist of the West has certainly gained currency over the past few years. The 2008 Russo-Georgian War, which split off pro-Russian Abkhazia and South Ossetia from the Republic of Georgia, the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, the support Moscow has given to pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, Russia's active military support of the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, multiple cyber intrusions into Western corporate and government institutions, and of course the well-known American accusations of Russian involvement in the election of Donald J. Trump as U.S. President. It is not hard to consider Russia the enemy of the West, especially since the imposition of Western sanctions on Russia for its occupation and incorporation of Crimea, a bold move and one which shook the Western European military alliance NATO and rattled the nerves of former Soviet-occupied Europe. The span and intensity of Russian military exercises over the past 5 years has increased. This is partly to do with ongoing reform of the Russian military and partly to do with scoring propaganda points against the West. Today, we ask Commodore Tyrrell to share his insights into what Zapad-17 sought to achieve and whether it forebodes the worst of our fears about Vladimir Putin's Russia. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, and our podcast on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Hi Pat, and welcome back to Strategicon.
It's lovely to be here.
Pat, Russia claimed that Zapad-17 was purely a defensive exercise. Has Zapad-17 demonstrated Russian intent across the former Soviet space, as some have contended? And if so, how is this different from, say, the 2014 annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, the continuing low-level fighting in the frozen conflict zone of eastern Ukraine? Surely these actions were far more assertive and aggressive.
I think it's important to recognize that when looking at Russia, it's a bit like looking at Alice's view through the looking glass. Things are what they seem to be, and they aren't what they seem to be. Zapad-17, as far as the Russians were concerned, is a purely defensive exercise. But of course, attack is often the best form of defense, and all military men and women are aware of that fact and will be looking to see how they can leverage defense through attack. And the Russians are no different. So they look at their Baltic neighbours, which of course were part of the Soviet Union for many years. They are very thankful to Stalin for making the mad dash into Kaliningrad at the end of the Second World War and seizing a port on the Baltic, which of course has been something that that Russia, long before the Soviet Union, was keen to have an ice-free port so it could get out at all times of the year. Now, Zapad was used in 2014 as a precursor to the annexation of Crimea. Who is to say that Zapad 19 or 20 won't be used as a launch pad to annex the Baltic states? Would Russia like to? I'm sure it would. Putin has often said that he wants to go back to the size and shape of the Soviet Union in terms of a modern Russia. And that, of course, applies to the Ukraine as well. But whether they will or not, I think depends on an awful lot more. I think that the Russians don't want to take too big a bite of the buffalo, if you like, in terms of really getting NATO exercised about it, because they know they cannot afford anything like a major confrontation with the West at the moment.
Pat, was Zapad 17 in violation of the OSCE's Vienna document, where there are upper limits by which, certain countries can exercise military force without having international observers? I mean, how many Russian forces took to the field, and should there have been international observers at Zapad 17?
Well, I think I'll answer that in reverse order. Certainly, according to the Vienna document, there should have been well-established international observers watching a large exercise like Zapad 17. They weren't there. So in that sense, there was a violation of OSCE. I'm not aware that there were that the number of people that were taking part in the exercise was in any contravention of the terms of the Vienna document. But of course, that's part of the reason why you would have had observers there to participate in it, to report back on that sort of thing. So, the Russians clearly didn't want the West to be too involved. I think, as much as anything, just to annoy the West. This was using a bit of muscle to say, no, we're not going to tell you what we're doing. It's our exercise, because it made them feel stronger or able to put a stick in the eye of NATO and the United States.
Some were saying that the peculiar nature of the way that Zapad 17 was organised, it was done almost in a sort of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary way, where it was a mobilisation of the whole of nation kind of assets. So we're looking at elements of the bureaucracy, some of which have got a paramilitary bent. And so the Russians could cleverly get around whatever the Vienna document said with regard to having international observers at such a mobilization. What do you think about that? Do you think that the Russians were just playing it very clever?
Well, I think that Russia has always been, in Winston Churchill's words, a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, and they do it. They are deliberately opaque. The whole purpose. This is why Russians are probably amongst the best chess players in the world, and again, nothing happens at the military level that is not agreed at the political level. So, if Putin didn't want something to happen, it would not happen. And consequently, I think that Putin and his team, they want to keep the West guessing as to their motives. I mean, this is good Sun Tzu tactics, and Russia, above all, understands that. Whether at the end of the day it has the forces and the effective command and control structure to be able to deliver on that threat is something for a whole other discussion.
Actually, I was going to raise that a little bit later, but maybe we can touch on that. It has been said that Zapad 17 was as much a demonstration of Russian military power against NATO as it was an exercise designed to take control of the Belarus military in case of war. What is your take on the exercise and what it sought to achieve?
This is back to the first question. These exercises have a series of layered objectives. The first objective is to make sure that you can field large units of the Army and Air Force. You can coordinate them together. You can refine your command and control. You can make sure that when you want to send units to a particular pace, they get there in the right time and with the right equipment, etc., etc. Then above that, there is clearly a message to NATO saying, we're ready for you. Don't think that because Russian forces went through such a dire straits in the 90s, we're no longer that Army, Navy and Air Force. We have restructured, we've got new equipment, we are moving on, and we are now doing, grown-up exercises of the sort that NATO has been doing for a number of years. So within these layers, you have to understand from your view of an observer, what is the message that the Russians are trying to send to you? Is it a combination of all these different layers, or is it just, I want you to know that we're ready, or I want you to know that we're an effective military? What is it? And all of these are very carefully planned. So I think that the answer is that, Belarus is very much seen as a client state to Russia. And is quite happy to have its military and its political structures involved in a major Russian exercise. They don't see that as being a diminution of their sovereignty. It just shows that really they're all the same.
Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko was worried about the Russian exercise. From a military perspective, Russian use of Belarus military installations and facilities gives them a forward base from which to potentially launch attacks against Ukraine. How real is the threat Russia poses to Ukraine? Has Moscow stretched Russian Federation military power to breaking point, or do you think it has sufficient reserves to fight a state-on-state war with Ukraine?
Well, I think the bottom line is that it could fight a state-on-state war with Ukraine. I think that there is a certain reluctance to get sucked into that at the moment. I think that, Russia wants to keep, as I've said before, keep the West on its toes so that it doesn't know what's going on. I think that the Russians had hoped to have destabilized far more of Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. Now we've got a situation where there's a sort of stalemate in the region. But, the Russians are moving to make sure that Crimea can remain an entity, a profitable entity, if you like, within Russia. They're building the big bridge across the straits into Crimea, so that Crimea is no longer reliant on crossing former Ukrainian territory to get into Russia. And that will tend to make the issue of who owns the ground in that part of the Ukraine irrelevant to a degree, because Crimea will be able to be an integral part of the Russian Federation. I think that Poroshenko is naturally worried about a Russian attack. Do I think it's likely? The answer is no. I think that Russia has got as I say, it started modernizing its forces. It's got quite a long way to go. And it knows that if it goes into Ukraine in a big way, it will undoubtedly come up against NATO at some stage. And NATO will be definitely trying to make sure that it doesn't engage in that sort of activity. Now, the point that the Russians have, of course, is that if you keep Ukraine on its toes, you keep it in a sense of suspense, it's much easier then to manipulate the political parties. And, the Russians, whether or not one can say they actually put Trump into the White House, there is no doubt that the Russians have a great many tools at their behest. So, disturbing and disrupting the political process in the Ukraine is a much easier thing to do than in the United States. And if they tried in the United States, they could do it quite easily in the Ukraine. And they will tend to wait and dwell a pause. Putin would like to make sure he does it during his time in office. And he may well be in office for another 6 years. But that gives him plenty of time. There will be, at least one, if not two elections in the intervening time in the Ukraine, where he can disrupt the political process. And he may well be able to achieve everything he wants to achieve by doing that, so that it goes. And the balance between the Russian-leaning political groups and the Western-leaning political groups is quite fine. And, the Russians may well be able to push them in a direction without having to use any military at all.
Which then leads us to the next question. What is NATO's position regarding keeping Ukraine out of Russia's crosshairs? Has this job been subcontracted to Poland and Romania?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that NATO is quite keen that things are done by the rule of law. NATO is really essentially a number of governments coming together to make joint policy. And it's only when there is a clear military threat that NATO tends to act on its own.
And now we'll take a short musical interlude. You're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA. and that was the 1984 late Cold War anti-war classic by German band Nena, 99 Luftballons. Now we'll return to Strategicon, episode 36, Zapad 17, Routine Russian Military Training Exercise or Template for War.
So it's this consensual approach. If Ukraine voted in some sort of election or referendum that they wanted to be part of Russia, then NATO would abide by that decision. What NATO is trying to do is to make sure that there is a level playing field. So if it sees things happening, it can make sure people know that those things are happening. Now, do you think the job has been subcontracted to Poland and Romania? I mean, I think that the Poles and the Romanians have a much closer relationship with Ukraine. They are both, to one degree or other, successful partners in NATO. They've come in, they are now part of the military structure. They've shown how these things can work. And therefore, putting them up as an ambassador, if you like, for NATO into the Ukraine, that might beg the question of whether NATO would ever allow Ukraine to become a member of NATO. I think the answer to that is no, because that would be definitely like a red rag to a bull. And actually what we really want to do is to make sure that NATO states have buffer states around them, separating them from Russia, because then it means that there isn't nearly as much room for engineering military clashes on a border that is shared if you've got some country like Ukraine sort of keeping you apart.
Pat, we've seen Russian high technology demonstrated on the battlefields of Syria recently, but how strong are Russia's anti-access area denial or A2AD capabilities?
I think generally not as good as the Russians would like us to believe. I think that there have been, as you say, there have been a number of demonstrations, but actually those have been just that. They've been demonstrations. And don't forget this multi-layered thing of what you're trying to do, from right the way from the basic military, I've got a weapon, can I use it properly, all the way up to I'm sending a political signal that, we've got the ability to be able to take on the Baltic states or the Ukraine or wherever. The general view has been that when they're done as a demonstration, people are making sure that they work. But, when they're being used as a part of the military inventory, they are not nearly as successful.
Could you say something along the lines of that's the reason why we haven't actually seen more of the so-called layered anti-aircraft defences, Russian anti-aircraft defences like the S-300, S-400, taking more of a toll on Western fighter aircraft or incoming cruise missiles?
Well, I think the Russians, although of course they wouldn't admit it, but the downing of the Malaysian aircraft quite clearly by Russian anti-air missiles has hurt Russia's standing. They won't admit it. They certainly would never say sorry, but it has hurt their standing, and therefore I don't think that they have tried too hard. I mean, I don't think they have wanted to bring down Western fighters, because then that moves the thing into a whole new ball game. And Putin, he's got enough problems on his plate. without actually going and stirring up a hornet's nest, which is what he would do if he starts to do something and let's say an American aircraft gets shot down and a pilot is killed or is captured. He would not be able to determine what the results of that would be. And he's not going to do anything where there is uncertainty as to what the outcome might be.
Well, that would fly in the face of the deterrent, the promise of deterrence that these systems would have on the ground for the forces of Bashar al-Assad and the Russian forces. Because why would you deploy, the S-400 and the S-300 if you're not going to intend to use them in anger? If you're not going to show the world just how good these systems are. Because obviously, if there was a successful shoot down of an American fighter, or say, for instance, the next volley of US cruise missiles hitting Syrian installations get blown out of the sky by Russian anti-aircraft weapons, obviously everyone would be beating a path to Moscow's door to buy these systems. I mean, we already see that the Turks and even the Saudis are now starting to show interest in buying these systems, but they've not been demonstrated in the warlike capacity yet, have they?
No, they haven't, which does lead me to wonder whether they actually perform in the way that the Russians say they perform. And as I said at the beginning, sometimes when they do a demonstration, the equipment is so carefully prepared, it's almost in laboratory conditions, whereas, you're far from laboratory conditions when you've got a sort of dusty launch platform that's just been hauled over, very rocky roads and everything else, and you're aiming it for it to fire and work. And I think that there is a lot of uncertainty as to whether some of these weapons do what it says on the tin.
The loss of Ukraine, following on from the collapse of the USSR, robbed Russia of strategic depth, industry, population, and other resources. How did this create the contemporary situation between Moscow and the West? Was a siege mentality by the Russians justified?
Well, the short answer to that is no. Was the West pleased to see the end of the Soviet Union? Yes, it was, but that wasn't anything to do with the territories that were occupied by the Soviet Union itself, and particularly not the Ukraine, which of course many Russians would say was the heart of Russia. That's where Rus is, in what is now Ukraine. I think that, the West was delighted that the communist political experiment had finally been shown to be completely lacking in its ability to give its population the right share of wealth, of being able to do whatever they wanted to do, being able to live fulfilled lives. It was clearly oppressive and had been extremely oppressive for most of its 80 years of existence. Now, so from that point of view, the difference, of course, came because the people of Ukraine voted to be a separate country. Now, the West didn't encourage it and didn't discourage it because, from the West's point of view, it was up to the population of the Ukraine to decide what to do. Now, Russian politicians believe that you should never give people any say in how they run their affairs. That's the default position. And as Putin has become has accumulated more and more of the state power to those instruments he controls, we're moving back to the sort of situation that, the old Tsars of Russia would recognize. King Louis of France said, "L'État et moi," The state is me. And that, of course, is what Putin believes. What I say is good for the state is good for the state. What has happened is that Russia, as you rightly say, suddenly saw a large population, large resources slipping away from it, which, as it tries to reassert itself, is thinking to itself, well, actually, that would have been quite nice to have it. Those resources, that is Russia, that's the heart of Russia. Russia is now a country that demands respect and recognition. I mean, Russia is a country that's economically, in a really bad place. And this, of course, is one of the things that Putin is trying to wrestle with. He's also got a bunch of oligarchs who raped the country, quite literally, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, making huge amounts of money out of things that really actually belong to the people.
Geographically speaking, the Russian Federation is immense. It is also quite vulnerable, spanning 11 time zones and some 8,000 kilometres in length, 3,200 kilometres from north to south, with the core of its population concentrated in Europe, not in the Asian expanse of Central Asia and Siberia. What would a non-threatening Russian defensive posture look like?
I'm not sure you can ever have a defensive posture that is non-threatening. Because you need a defensive posture that a potential aggressor is going to think twice before attacking. Now, I think that you're right at the moment. Russia is vast. And really, nobody is interested at the moment in Siberia and up into the Arctic. I have to say that depending upon the world's need for oil, which may well be lessening, and indeed some of the advances that are being put forward at the moment may accelerate that lessening of demand for oil. But if oil remained a major resource, then you would see people eyeing the Arctic coast. And, of course, Russia has already taken very active steps to defend the Arctic. It's also claiming a huge amount of the Arctic, a bit like the Chinese and the South China Sea, so that they are looking at defending that. Now, whether any real threat is going to emerge in the Arctic, I can't see it in the next few years. I think that the biggest threat that they might get is in the east from China, depending what happens in China, and they're also coming up against a very hard border in the West against the European states. So Putin has to balance where his priorities are going to lie. And I think that he will certainly continue to spend money on his military. He will continue to vaunt his military as being a highly successful, a highly capable force that can go in and can attack to stop what it sees as threats to itself. And of course, we live in a world of multiple threats, not just military threats. We're no longer going in because we need to take over steel works, or we're going to take over oil fields, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. It's a much broader set of threats. So I mentioned Russia and the political chicanery, but hacking, cyber warfare, all of these things, Russia will continue to use in a way just to upset the West. I mean, this is a good way of sticking pins into this rather moribund lion, who actually, if NATO wakes up, might not look much like a lion anyway and look more like a pussycat.
Okay, well, turning to Europe's Nordic north, Sweden, long a target of Russian intimidation, it conducted its own military exercise just before the commencement of Russia's Zapad 17, called Aurora 17 and designed to test the defensibility of Sweden's largest island, Gotland. How was this exercise perceived by NATO? Sweden is still technically a neutral country.
Yes, Sweden's a neutral country, but, actually one of the important things about neutrality is that you can defend your neutrality if called upon to do so. And so you only have to look at, say, Belgium, which was neutral at the end of the 19th century. It then got walked over in 1940 by the Blitzkrieg, and there was no question of whether Belgium was neutral or not. It just didn't exist. And the Swedes have woken up. The Swedes were cashing in their defence dividend, because the Soviet Union disappeared. Everyone was happy and whatever. And they really hollowed out their defence forces over the 90s and the early parts of this century. And suddenly they were faced with a Russia that was quite prepared to go into the Ukraine. It was quite prepared to take over Crimea. It started talking about things it was going to do on its western flank. There are there were frequent incursions of Russian submarines into Swedish waters, and the Swedes have suddenly felt we need to do something. We need to be able to demonstrate that even though we're a neutral country, if someone attacks us, we are going to give them at least a bloody nose. They'd never be able to stop a determined Russian attack, but they would certainly be able to stop the tempo. Now, whether Sweden will become a member of NATO, I suspect not. I think that there's a lot of national pride in being a neutral country. But at the same time, there's the view that if Sweden were to be attacked, it's almost inevitable that NATO would come in and would give it some support. That's not to say that Sweden would be covered by Article 5, but, NATO would certainly not want to see Sweden fall, say, to a resurgent Russia. So I think, and it's one of these political conundrums that, you've got to spend some money to be able to have capable defence. And that's what the Swedes are doing at the moment. I think that Aurora 17, there were a number of quite good lessons that came out of that, which will be examined and explored by the Swedish military, and they will look at improving their equipment and their command and control systems, etc.
Okay, well, anyway, Pat, thanks very much for sharing your insights with us, and that brings this episode to a close. We look forward to having you back again soon.
That's a pleasure, John. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes and SoundCloud, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. Also, please take time to comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, Twitter or SoundCloud, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.